You waited for it. The promotion, the new apartment, the finished project, the vacation you had been planning for months. You imagined how it would feel when it finally happened. And then, it did. For a brief moment, something changed. Not around you, inside you. You thought, I made it. But something strange happened next. Not weeks later, not months later. Sometimes, before the day was even over. That feeling had already begun to fade. Life quietly returned to normal. The emails came back, the notifications returned, the next problem appeared. The next deadline demanded your attention. And what had felt like the beginning of a new chapter was already becoming another ordinary day. So here's a strange question. When did important moments stop feeling different from everything else? Maybe life didn't stop giving us meaningful moments. Maybe we slowly stopped experiencing them as meaningful. Before we continue, this film is part of a larger investigation called Protocol Multiverse. Punchline Protocol explores the human experience. Darkside Protocol explores the hidden systems that quietly shape it. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives and reveals the patterns that only become visible when they're seen together. If you'd like to follow the complete investigation, you'll find every chapter in the description below. Now, let's continue. Nothing about this happened overnight. There wasn't a single morning when you woke up and decided that important moments should matter less. In fact, every achievement still looked important from a distance. You still worked for it, planned for it, imagined it. But something had quietly changed in the space between expectation and experience. The feeling no longer stayed. Every milestone was absorbed almost immediately into the rhythm of ordinary life. Finishing a difficult project became another completed task. Moving into a new home became another address. Even moments you once believed you would remember forever slowly blended into everything that came after them. Not because they weren't real, not because they weren't meaningful, but because life had stopped making space around them. There was no pause. No clear boundary between what had just happened and whatever came next. One moment simply dissolved into another, until even extraordinary experiences began to feel surprisingly ordinary. The strange part isn't that important moments became less important. The strange part is that they stopped interrupting the rhythm of life. Once, a significant event created a boundary. There was life before it and life after it. Now, even the biggest moments are absorbed into the same continuous flow, not because they became smaller, because everything around them became equally urgent. And when every moment demands the same attention, even extraordinary moments lose the chance to feel extraordinary. If you look back, it isn't difficult to find important moments. They're still there. The promotion, the wedding, the child who was born, the house you finally moved into, the project that once felt impossible to finish. None of these moments disappeared, yet something else did. They no longer seem to stand apart from everything around them. They blend into an endless sequence of emails, meetings, errands, notifications, and ordinary responsibilities. Not because those moments became smaller, but because everything else became louder. The extraordinary no longer arrives surrounded by silence. It arrives in the middle of another busy Tuesday. Before your mind has time to understand that something important has happened, life is already asking for your attention somewhere else. And slowly, almost without noticing, you stop measuring life by its milestones. You begin measuring it by whatever comes next. Significance may never have been created by the event itself. Perhaps it was created by the space that surrounded it. Every meaningful moment once interrupted the rhythm of life. It asked you to stop, to look, to remain there just a little longer. But when every hour already belongs to something else, even extraordinary experiences lose the room they need to become extraordinary. The event still happens, the achievement is still real, the celebration still exists. What quietly disappears is the distance between one chapter and the next. And without that distance, life doesn't lose its moments. It loses the feeling that one moment was ever different from another. There was a time when important moments naturally divided life into chapters. You could say, that was before I moved, before I became a parent, before I started that job. Those moments created clear lines in the story you told yourself. Today, those lines feel harder to find. Not because your life became less eventful. If anything, more is happening than ever before. More conversations, more decisions, more responsibilities, more updates, more information. Yet somehow, everything begins to arrive with the same emotional volume. A major achievement, a routine task, a message, a meeting, a celebration. They all enter the same uninterrupted stream. And when everything arrives without changing the rhythm, even remarkable moments stop feeling remarkable. They don't disappear. They simply lose the contrast that once allowed you to recognize them. Perhaps this is why so many people describe life as becoming faster. Not because time itself has changed, but because fewer moments interrupt its flow. A story without chapters is difficult to remember. A song without pauses becomes difficult to follow. And a life without emotional boundaries can quietly begin to feel like one continuous movement. The events are still there. The years are still there. But the mind no longer experiences them as separate places. It experiences them as one long continuation. And continuation has a quiet side effect. It makes even extraordinary moments feel expected before they have the chance to feel extraordinary. The strange part is that you probably still celebrate. You still smile when something good happens. You still tell your family. You still call a friend. Nothing on the surface looks broken. But if you pay close attention, something else has changed. The feeling doesn't stay where it once did. Before it has time to settle, your mind quietly begins asking a familiar question. What's next? Not because you're ungrateful, not because the moment wasn't real, because your attention has learned to keep moving. One achievement immediately becomes the starting point for another. One finish quietly becomes another beginning. And over time, life starts feeling less like a collection of meaningful chapters and more like an endless process that never quite pauses long enough to let you fully arrive. Significance doesn't depend only on what happens. Perhaps it also depends on permission. Permission to stop. Permission to remain with what has already happened instead of immediately preparing for what comes next. But modern life rarely rewards that pause. It quietly teaches momentum instead. And momentum has an unusual effect. It keeps life moving forward while slowly reducing the emotional distance between one achievement and the next. Eventually, nothing feels unimportant. But nothing feels truly significant either. Everything becomes equally urgent. Everything becomes equally temporary. And when every moment is treated the same, the mind gradually loses its ability to recognize that some moments were meant to become landmarks. After a while, something even stranger begins to happen. You stop expecting important moments to feel important. Before they even arrive, part of you already assumes that the feeling won't last. You still work toward the goal. You still look forward to the vacation. You still count the days until something you've wanted finally happens. But somewhere beneath that anticipation, another expectation quietly appears. That life will return to normal almost immediately. And most of the time, it does. One day, you stop wondering why important moments feel so small. You simply begin expecting them to. Not because the moment failed, not because you imagined it, but because normal has become incredibly efficient at absorbing everything that enters it. Success becomes routine. Change becomes routine. Even happiness quietly becomes routine. Until one day you realize that you no longer ask, "How did this change my life?" You simply ask, "What's on tomorrow?" Perhaps the greatest change isn't that significant moments disappear, Perhaps it's that ordinary life has become powerful enough to absorb almost anything without changing its own rhythm. Every system seeks stability. Every routine seeks continuity. Every schedule tries to return to equilibrium. Eventually, that same pattern begins to shape the way experience itself is felt. Extraordinary moments are no longer rejected. They are simply processed. It quietly becomes part of the ordinary. Life keeps moving as if nothing important had happened, not because nothing happened, but because the rhythm has learned how to continue without ever truly stopping. And perhaps that is the quiet price of becoming endlessly adaptable. Maybe that's why this feeling is so difficult to describe. Nothing is obviously wrong. Your life may look exactly the way you once hoped it would. You achieve things you once dreamed about. You solve problems that once seemed impossible. You become more experienced, more capable, more responsible. From the outside, the story looks successful. Yet from the inside, something feels strangely flat. Not because your life has lost meaning, but because meaning no longer has enough contrast to announce itself. When every week demands the same level of attention, every achievement begins to arrive with the same emotional volume. Eventually, the question is no longer whether your life is meaningful. The question becomes whether you still notice the moments that give it meaning at all. Significance isn't something we create. Perhaps it was something we could only recognize. Recognition requires contrast. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to remain with an experience long enough for it to become part of us. But when every meaningful moment is immediately surrounded by the urgency of everything that follows, that recognition quietly fades. Life doesn't become empty, it becomes continuous. And continuity has a remarkable quality. It keeps us moving, while making it increasingly difficult to notice where one meaningful chapter quietly ended and another one began. Perhaps the goal was never to make life more exciting. Perhaps life has always contained enough moments worth remembering. The question is whether we still allow those moments to remain different from everything that surrounds them. Not every conversation needs to become another task. Not every achievement needs to become another starting line. Not every ending needs to disappear into the next beginning. Maybe significance isn't something life gives us. Maybe it's something we quietly lose when every moment is treated as equal to the one that follows. And perhaps that's why so many people look back years later and wonder where the important parts went. They didn't disappear. They simply stopped standing apart. Perhaps every meaningful life is built the same way, not from endless progress, but from moments that interrupt it. Moments that refuse to become just another item on the timeline. Moments that ask nothing more than to be fully experienced before they quietly become memory. Maybe the measure of a life has never been how many things happened. Maybe it has always been how many moments remained distinct enough to become chapters. Because when every chapter is allowed to feel like just another page, one day the entire story begins to read like a single, uninterrupted sentence. Perhaps nothing became less meaningful. Perhaps life simply stopped slowing down long enough for meaning to leave its mark. The next email will arrive. The next project will begin. The next goal will eventually replace the one you just reached. That rhythm may never completely disappear, but before you step into whatever comes next, ask yourself one quiet question. How long did this moment remain different? Maybe the greatest loss isn't that important moments become ordinary. Maybe it's that ordinary life becomes so continuous that nothing is ever given the chance to become extraordinary. A meaningful life is not built from bigger achievements. It is built from moments that remain distinct enough to become part of who you are. Because once every experience becomes equally temporary, significance doesn't disappear from life. It quietly disappears from memory. If this film helped you recognize something you had never put into words, this is only one part of a much larger investigation. Punchline Protocol explores the human experience. Dark Side Protocol explores the systems that quietly shape it. Debrief Protocol connects both perspectives and reveals the patterns that only become visible when you step back. If you'd like to follow the complete investigation, you'll find every chapter waiting in the description below. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation remains yours.